And also I'd like to thank João Quintana and, of course, José Eduardo. Thank you so much. Thank you. What I would like to talk about really is the issue of intercultural communication. And the title is Where We've Been, issues we face, and where we're going. When considering this term, intercultural, it's impossible to deny its complexity. Intercultural communication has typically been defined as communication between people from different national cultures. However, the field of intercultural communication has grown significantly since its early beginnings. In the first systematic review of intercultural communication theories, which was called the International and Intercultural Communication Annual in 1983, a group of researchers theorized about the interpersonal communication between people from different cultures. These initial theories were followed up in 1988 by a publication by Kim and Goody Kunst, where they had empirical support and research on communication from people from different cultures. This early theory building was supported by the works of Hall, Traeger, and many others from communication, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and literature. However, the discipline that is called intercultural communication has grown and changed a lot since then. Today, intercultural communication as a discipline includes more theories than ever before, and an increasing focus on different contexts, and an increasing debate on what is intercultural. To this end, what I'd like to do today is present an overview of the state of the intercultural communication discipline. So the purpose of my discussion is threefold, three things. First, I'd like to review where we've been as a discipline. Second, discuss where we're going, with the focus on how researchers are more and more borrowing constructs from other disciplines, which we should be doing. And third, identify some key issues, some challenges, and some opportunities for the field. So, where have we been? What is the discipline? Global communication, diplomacy, and business after World War II created a need for practical frameworks of communication that weren't based only on linguistics. The first steps came from the likes of Worf and Freudian psychoanalytics. Then came the work of Edward T. Hall, who revolutionized the field with his 1959 book, The Silent Language. After this book, it took about 10 years for the field to find its way into communication departments. The first official university class happened at Pittsburgh University in the late 1960s, and it was called Intercultural Communication Theories. In 1970, the International Communication Association, and later the Speech Communication Association, which is now called the National Communication Association, founded divisions called Intercultural and International Communication Association. These were key steps in developing the field, that is intercultural, as they helped produce textbooks, journals, and other academic items. After the 1980s, the field became more developed as researchers started to develop measurement tools and further theories. The field evolved in different ways throughout the world. This evolution has been dependent on many social and political issues that have happened in different countries. Due to the multicultural nature of the US society in particular, issues of integration, politics, and intercultural understanding was a primary motivation for universities to develop intercultural programs, whether they were in communication departments, political science, and so forth. However, in Japan, the need for communication skills in English, particularly in business, led for a need for intercultural communication courses being taught in language programs. And often these courses are named English language, not intercultural communication. Recently, more programs have been established in China, Singapore, Hong Kong. These courses are often taught in business programs with the focus on business competence. Intercultural communication, as a relatively new discipline in most universities, is an answer to complexities of our modern world, with a wide range of cultural characteristics and needs. To that end, the field has approached research from different perspectives. While it's impossible to review all the theories in the field, this would take many doctoral dissertations, and we would be here for many, many hours. What I'd like to do is talk about two key areas of research that have been the focus of intercultural communication researchers: identity issues and adaptation. Within each of these areas of research, what I'll do is briefly touch on some theories that have really led the field over the past few decades. If we look first of all at intercultural communication and identity, there are two ways really to approach issues of identity in intercultural communication: the traditional and the modern, which has been borrowed from psychology, sociology, and anthropology. The traditional paradigm argues communication is an internal source of conflict and identity stress, during which communication tries to reduce our fear and anxiety of who we are, not only as individuals, but also in a community. Identity is this multidimensional notion consisting of our psychological and social aspects. And we negotiate it, we try to understand it every day until we reach some understanding with ourselves and with others. However, the modern paradigm argues that identity is an animated, dynamic idea whose form depends on the time and the context in which we live in. So under these two approaches, scholars have proposed different types of identity, such as our ethnic identity, our sexual identity, our gender identity, our personal identity. We have religious identities, political identities, and so on. But for time's sake, I'll just talk about a few different issues. One of the main theories that has been studied in communication, which really does come from sociology. I'm often asked by my parents, particularly when I first started doing a PhD in communication, what is it? You're studying journalism, right? No. I tried to explain to my parents, basically I'm doing sociology or psychology, but differently. And you'll see a lot of the theories come from sociology, psychology, anthropology, and so on. We just study it in a different way. The first one, social identity theory, goes back to Tajfel and Turner in the 1970s. What we have, all of us, are personal and social identities. Our personal identity looks at certain identity characteristics which are personal to us and not linked to a cultural or social group. However, individuals keep and emphasize identities that link them to a desired group that we want to be a part of and have a positive self-image with that group, while communicating in an intergroup level. So for example, when I communicate with other Americans, people would say, I'm communicating with people like me, even though more and more I feel less and less American, particularly when I see Donald Trump doing well on the television. Americans should be my intergroup. They should be my in-group. They should be the ones I'm closest to. If you're born in Portugal, the researchers would say Portuguese are your in-group. But we have multiple in-groups, the groups we identify with the most. And often, we try to make ourselves feel and look more like the in-group. because it gives us a sense of community and identity. While at the same time, we separate, we differentiate ourselves from the out-group. Examples of this include, over the past 10 years, we've seen rioting, we've seen upheaval, we've seen conflicts in some European nations, such as France, where we've had in-groups, Muslims, Catholics, Christians, separating themselves from each other based on religious identity. Throughout the world, we see this. Us, them. Going back to Edward Said's idea of the other. Cultural identity, this is the stress that individuals put on some emotional connection or affiliation with a culture. Now, there's thousands of definitions of culture, but it's a shared sense of meaning, symbols, norms, and so forth, to make it simple. The level to which one is a member of a culture, or they think they're a member of a culture, is the level to which you understand the symbols, the norms, the rules, the heroes, the rituals, and so forth, going back to people like Hall, Geertz, and so on and so forth. Cultural identity has two key elements. What value do you place on that culture and your identity? And also salience. Value refers to the expectations that are necessary for how we evaluate our culture. Salience is the level to which members of the culture have a strong attachment to it. So I mentioned being an American. Before I moved to Finland, I had much more salience in my American cultural identity. I felt more, all right, Americanness. Less and less now, I feel more and more European, more mixed cultural identity. And this can be affected by lots of things, such as changes in the culture. So that can affect how we feel. So, cultural identity is influenced by the extent to which you are acculturated or changed in a new culture. So if you migrate, that can affect how you feel about your previous culture. Experiences abroad, experiences with other cultures. The generation. You have second, third generation immigrant. Generally, the second and third generation will have less connection to the previous cultures of their parents or grandparents. Your needs, your situation, economic, for example. Economics often, we've seen in the US history, will override someone's religious values or gender values. Studies on cultural identity have been conducted in numerous contexts, numerous countries, and are gaining more and more strength in their results. We also see a lot of research on something called face. Face is, according to Ting Toomey and Koroji, a claimed sense of a favorable social self-worth that a person wants others to have of him or her. Social interactions create conflict situations every day. And when individuals need to save or protect this self-worth, they take steps to do so. Face negotiation theory explains how various elements contribute to how we manage these conflicts when someone purposely, or maybe doesn't know they're doing it, questions who we want to be in life. This is called face work. Research has showed that there are differences between collectivistic and individualistic cultures in how they manage face in conflict situations, where more individualistic cultures want to win in a conflict because I must look like the winner. While in more communal conflicts, we both can try to win. It looks better if we both agree in the end and no one is the loser. There's also ethnic or ethno-linguistic identity theory, and very briefly going back to Giles and Johnson, looking more at linguistics, the idea of how in an ethnic language situation, so take for example the Catalans or the Basque as two examples, When we feel like our language is being threatened, often we link our language to our ethnic group. And this can lead to conflict between individuals' identities. So there's been quite a bit of work on different types of identity in intercultural communication. There's also issues of adaptation. Cultural adaptation is of paramount concern for researchers, policymakers, communities, nations, and individuals. And we can see issues of adaptation are increasingly important today as we look to the refugee and migrant issues facing Europe in 2015 and beyond. Researchers have produced a rich body of work on how people adapt or don't adapt to new cultures. In intercultural communication, two models have received the most attention, that of Barry's acculturation strategies and Young Kim's cross-cultural adaptation models. Barry's model looks at 4 strategies a newcomer can choose when they move to a new culture. So with both of these models, let's think about any immigrants that you know, or if you've migrated to a new culture and you're faced with decisions of, do I adapt, do I not, or different choices. The choice for Barry depends on what desire do you have to maintain your native heritage or adapt to the new culture. The 4 strategies are: you assimilate, so you abandon your previous self entirely and become 100% like the new culture. Separation, the newcomer keeps the original culture and you avoid contact with the new culture. Most research shows this is very difficult to do. Marginalization is when the newcomer shows little interest in either. So they don't like their old culture or the new culture. They develop a third. And integration, when they mix the two cultures together, which is what we find most people try to do, is to integrate. What we find is that research has been conducted in numerous countries throughout the past 30, 40 years and found that often assimilation is virtually impossible, while integration seems to be the most practical choice. The other model is Kim's cross-cultural adaptation, and she borrows heavily from Barry's work. Her model is a multi-step process, where first, she argues we are enculturated. We grow up being something. So I'll use me as an example. Kim would argue that I was enculturated as an American. I was socialized. So I was taught by my family, by media, everything around me in the US to be Stephen. And then I moved to Finland. The next stage is deculturation, where I notice things around me are a bit different. It's not the US anymore. I have to make decisions. What do I change about myself? Which leads to the third stage, acculturation. Do I become Finnish? Do I become Amero-Finnish, American Finnish, Finnish American? Do I 100% Finnish? Do I become 100% American still? What do I do? Kim's ultimate goal is I should become 100% Finnish. But that has a lot of difficulty with it. Becoming 100% anything that you were not raised is very difficult, if not impossible. So there's been a lot of research looking at this issue, and if it's possible or not. So you have to ask yourself, if you moved somewhere new, could you 100% abandon your identity? So where are we going? When we look to this, one of the key things I want to talk about is the research on intercultural communication and social media. Social media and intercultural communication have a lot of similar research interests, particularly regarding identity, acculturation, and the relationship between culture and power. One main question when looking at social media from an intercultural viewpoint is, to what extent do issues encountered in face-to-face situations translate online. Exploring ways in which people create their identities online is one of the main areas researchers are looking at now. Processes of self-presentation in face-to-face and online contexts share the idea that individuals are active in expressing varying and different identities, particularly in the context in which individuals use normal or traditional identity categories, such as nationality or ethnicity in social media. These historic identity categories are now vanishing online. A common assumption is that virtual spaces allow individuals to create entirely new categories that we don't understand. Results depict this idea that cultural spaces are something we just don't understand as researchers, as politicians, as economists, and so forth. Whereby now, national identification is almost wiped away when you go online. It's nowhere near as important as it once was, many are finding. But other researchers are finding it's just another way to show our national identity. So we're not sure yet what's happening with online communication. Immigrants and minorities also use social media in different ways that we're trying to understand. Studies indicate that the use of new media, for instance, to keep our cultural heritage, really does influence our cultural identity. Or it also influences our sense of community. The ways in which minorities use social media to express and negotiate identities are related to our cultural adaptation. Differences exist among the studies. There is no yes, no, black or white answer on this. However, results indicate that in the long term, being a regular user of ethnic or minority social media while trying to adapt to a new culture does limit cultural adaptation because one participates less in the dominant culture. They will have less friends from the dominant culture. They will understand the language less. They will have less information. So most research has found that for immigrants, it is best that they participate as much as possible in the social media of the dominant culture if they wish to integrate. Discussions about online identification show how culture is negotiated by individuals through adaptation. Social media are relevant to show us power and culture and how they interact with one another. Research in 2012, for example, showed how Western cultural references are used quite heavily in the online world. For example, how many computer programs are written using English script and so forth. Many of the pictures and other references come from the US and other English-speaking countries. And how for many years it was difficult to write in many social media programs without using English. Researchers have pointed out that social media can be used to escape from power relations by being anonymous. But then the question is, many cultures find being anonymous to be one of the worst things you can do. And so this is something else that is a very interesting difference. So within the field of intercultural communication, we can see it's growing quite rapidly. But there are many issues we face. And this is where I'd like to conclude, by looking at issues we face. There are 4 key issues that are crucial to the future of the field. The first is a debate over terms. Second, the debate over this idea of social learning versus biology. Then there's the spread of intercultural communication to less studied cultures and the place of critical cultural studies in the field. Briefly, the debate over terms. In a recent issue of the Journal of International and Intercultural Communication, one of the largest communication journals focusing just on intercultural communication, an issue was brought forth about the definition of intercultural communication. As the field diversifies, many are asking, do we need one definition for the field? A glance at any textbook in communication or intercultural communication will show that there isn't one single or one accepted definition of the field. And many researchers have pointed out that this is a good thing, while others, particularly administrators, have argued this is a very bad thing, that it would be better if the field was more agreed on things. So I predict we will have a continued discussion about what is the field itself. Second, this issue of biology. A significant body of research in intercultural communication is conducted from a social learning or situational approach. From this approach, researchers argue context, culture, and situation affect how we communicate. Thus, environment influences who we are and how we communicate. However, researchers are more and more looking at biology to understand how and why we communicate. Particularly, they're borrowing from psychology to look more at biological variables. This communo-biological approach asserts biological variables have more predictive strength than cultural variables or situational variables in predicting how or why we communicate. While this approach to research is, let's say, controversial, many see this push toward biological variables as completely Frankensteinish. They see it as going toward what Mary Shelley predicted. Others see it as very important to understanding the validity and reliability of the field. In fact, as researchers increasingly criticize the work of Hofstede as being generic, hegemonic, not applying to culture, sexist, for having flawed assumptions, for being inconsistent, for lacking empirical evidence and transparency, etc., others are arguing, how else can we grow the field without relying on barbaric scales and such? Some say this might be the way, going the route of biology. There's also the need to spread to less researched areas. One of the main issues that intercultural communication studies needs to address is localization and studying other cultures. Currently, intercultural communication is highly United States and East Asian focused. Not only are most of the studies in the field conducted in an American, and by this I mean US-based, or East Asian context, but almost all of the scales and theories have been designed by American researchers and primarily for the US culture. If you look to most of the journals, you will find so many of the studies have been conducted on American college campuses. This has limited generalization, and theories derived from this line of research are exceptionally skeptical. To build a more comprehensive theory of communication, it's necessary to study different cultures in different parts of the world. We have very little research conducted in the Middle East, African, or Central Asian contexts. These are major limitations. And finally, since the early 2000s, culture has become increasingly important across disciplines. A culturistic orientation, whereby culture, or rather cultural differences, is now held to be the main explanation for the way the human world functions, highlights the need to question and identify what is culture and how is culture used. Using critical perspectives in intercultural communication is likely to keep on developing in the near future as a response to the seemingly lazy use of the word culture in a world filled with growing inequalities. Critical intercultural communication examines the core concepts mentioned earlier in this talk identity, adaptation, social media, but associating them to particular contexts, historical background, and power relations, for example. Similarly, culture is regarded as filled, affected by power structures that have evolved throughout history and affect the intersection between race, gender, social class, nationality, politics, and so forth. These evolutions in conceptualizing, understanding core concepts used in intercultural communication open up new perspectives for research in the field. A strong belief of critical views is this emphasis on investigating contexts. This is a clear break from the nation-based approach to culture, which has been largely the focus of intercultural communication and sociological work for the past 20 years. The contextual focus of critical intercultural communication corresponds with this evolution of many fields in social sciences. More and more researchers are looking to combine critical views in studies of communication and media studies, identity negotiation, and online environments, intercultural competence and education, and so forth. Critical studies is likely to keep on expanding because it offers relevant analytical tools and research orientations that help us understand societies more in depth. The trajectories that the field of intercultural communication may take in the future highlight its multifaceted and deep nature. Such diversity has marked the history of the discipline, which has grown tremendously over the last 2 decades, renewing its scope and developing new theories. Challenges in defining its identity and concepts have made the field a very dynamic field, bursting with many new ideas and concepts. As such, ways in which the field could grow in the near future are manyfold. It is certain, however, that intercultural communication will continue to develop. Thank you very much.